Open your kitchen cabinet right now. There's a good chance you'll find a jar with a red lid and a spoon-shaped smear on the label. You've probably eaten it for breakfast. Maybe you ate it as a kid. But here's the strange part. Nutella wasn't invented to make you happy. It was invented because there wasn't enough chocolate to go around. In the 1940s, Italy was rationing cocoa. War had strangled supply chains, and chocolate, real chocolate, had become a luxury almost nobody could afford. A pastry maker in the Piedmont region named Pietro Ferrero had a problem. His customers wanted chocolate. He couldn't get enough of it. So he did something that sounds almost too simple to matter. He stretched the little cocoa he had by mixing it with something Piedmont had in abundance: hazelnuts. Why would a shortage become the foundation of one of the most successful food brands in history? Because scarcity forces reinvention, and reinvention, if it's cheap enough and tasty enough, doesn't just survive the crisis. It outlives it. Ferrero called his creation pasta gianduja, named after a regional carnival character. It was sold as a solid block, sliceable like bread wrapped in foil. It wasn't spreadable. It wasn't a breakfast food. It was essentially cheap chocolate for people who couldn't afford real chocolate. That's where most origin stories stop. A clever cost-cutting trick during wartime. But the actual financial genius of what would become Nutella hadn't happened yet. It happened in 1951 when Pietro's son, Michel Ferrero, took over the family business and asked a completely different question. Not, how do I stretch expensive cocoa, but, how do I get people to buy this every single day instead of once in a while? That single question changed everything. Michel reformulated the paste into a creamy, spreadable version. He named it Super Crema. And critically, he marketed it not as candy, not as dessert, but as something you spread on bread for breakfast. Why does that distinction matter so much financially? Because a chocolate treat is an occasional purchase. Something bought for a birthday, a holiday, a reward. But a breakfast spread is a habit. It gets bought every week, restocked automatically, built into a family's routine without anyone even thinking about it. This is the actual secret marketing trick, and it has almost nothing to do with clever slogans or catchy jingles. Michel Ferrero didn't just invent a tastier product. He invented a new occasion for people to consume it. And occasions, once they're locked into daily life, generate revenue in a completely different way than treats do. Researchers who study consumer habits, like psychologist Wendy Wood at the University of Southern California, have spent decades showing that once a behavior becomes tied to a stable daily context, like a specific time of day or a specific location in the kitchen, it stops requiring willpower or decision-making entirely. Just happens. Spreading Nutella on bread at breakfast wasn't competing with other chocolate purchases. It was competing with nothing because it had claimed a moment in the day that didn't have a default product yet. This is why the reformulation mattered more than the recipe. The recipe made it taste good. The reformulation made it repeat. But taste and habit still weren't enough on their own. Ferrero needed people to actually try it in the first place, and in the 1950s and 60s, there was no social media, no influencer marketing, no viral advertising to lean on. So the company ran something called the Diplomatico. Children could walk into a Ferrero shop, bring a piece of bread from home, and have it spread with Super Crema for free. Why would a company give away its product for nothing? Because the psychologist Robert Cialdini, decades later, would describe exactly this kind of tactic as the principle of reciprocity. When you receive something for free, especially something pleasurable, you feel a subtle pull to give something back. For a child, that pull isn't financial. It's emotional. They go home wanting more. And it's the parent holding the wallet who ends up paying that debt back, one jar at a time. The Diplomatico wasn't charity. It was customer acquisition, decades before that phrase existed in any business textbook. The cost of free samples was absorbed early, and it was paid back many times over through years of repeat household purchases. In 1964, the product was reformulated once more and renamed Nutella. Same daily use logic. Same hazelnut and cocoa base. But now riding a wave of post-war economic growth across Europe, with supermarkets expanding and household incomes rising fast enough that a jar of spreadable chocolate hazelnut paste was no longer a luxury. It was affordable, habitual, and everywhere. Now think about what happens once a habit like that takes root across an entire country. It doesn't stay in one country for long. Through the 1970s and 80s, Ferrero expanded Nutella distribution across Western Europe, then into North America, then further outward. But the expansion wasn't reckless. It followed the same pattern every single time. Find the breakfast table. Find the after-school snack. Claim the moment, not just the shelf space. By the time Nutella reached international markets, it wasn't introduced as a novelty. It was introduced as something that already looked and felt like it belonged in a home, because the entire product, from its texture to its packaging to its positioning, had been engineered around a routine that already existed everywhere. People eating bread in the morning. Here's a number that puts the scale of this in perspective. Ferrero now produces roughly 365,000 tons of Nutella every single year. That's not a rounding error. That's close to 1,000 tons of hazelnut spread, produced and consumed every day of the year somewhere on the planet. And the company behind it isn't small either. In its 2023 to 2024 financial year, the Ferrero Group reported consolidated revenue of about 18.4 billion euros, up nearly 9% from the year before. This is a company with more than 35 brands, sold in over 170 countries, employing tens of thousands of people worldwide. But here's the twist that makes this story interesting from a purely financial standpoint. Ferrero never went public. It never sold shares on a stock exchange. It remains to this day privately owned by the Ferrero family, currently led by Giovanni Ferrero, grandson of the company's founder. Why would a company avoid the very thing that usually accelerates growth? Access to public capital markets. Because public companies answer to quarterly earnings reports. Every 3 months, shareholders expect growth, and short-term pressure can quietly push a company toward decisions that boost this quarter's numbers at the expense of next decade's brand. Private ownership meant Ferrero could think in years, not quarters. They could spend decades building a habit into an entire continent's breakfast routine without ever needing to justify that spending to outside investors demanding faster returns. Ferrero has often been described by financial journalists as one of the most secretive major companies in the world. It doesn't publish detailed profitability breakdowns the way its publicly listed competitors are required to. It doesn't need to court analysts or defend its strategy on quarterly earnings calls. It simply builds slowly and lets the habit do the compounding. This is the part almost nobody talks about when they tell the Nutella story. It's not just a tale about a tasty spread. It's a case study in what patient capital, combined with habit-based product design, can accomplish when nobody's rushing you to hit next quarter's targets. Consider how differently this story might have gone if Ferrero had needed outside investors early on. A shareholder-driven company might have pushed to expand faster, cut ingredient costs further, or chase overseas markets before the product and its daily ritual had fully taken root. Instead, Ferrero built slowly in one region, around one meaningful daily occasion for years before expanding outward. There's a modern echo of this too. In 2007, fans in the United States created an unofficial holiday called World Nutella Day, a grassroots celebration that spread online with almost no direction from the company itself. Ferrero didn't need to manufacture buzz. It had already spent half a century manufacturing something more durable than buzz. A habit that people felt was worth celebrating on its own. Compare that to how most modern food brands try to grow today. Heavy paid advertising. Constant social media presence. Influencer partnerships negotiated quarter by quarter. All of it works to a point. But it's expensive, and it has to be renewed constantly because attention fades the moment the spending stops. Habit doesn't work that way. Once a product owns a moment in someone's day, the marketing cost of keeping that customer drops close to zero. Nobody needs to be convinced to eat breakfast. Ferrero simply made sure that when people did, there was already a jar in the cabinet. This is the quiet financial lesson underneath the whole story. The most valuable thing a product can capture isn't attention. Attention is rented moment by moment, and it has to be paid for again and again. What Ferrero captured instead was a slot in the daily routine, something closer to owned real estate in a person's schedule than a fleeting moment of interest. None of this means every product needs decades of patience or a family-owned structure to succeed. Some products genuinely benefit from speed, from public capital, from rapid scaling. But it does mean the businesses that quietly dominate a category for generations often aren't the ones with the loudest advertising. They're the ones that found an ordinary daily moment nobody had claimed yet, and built something reliable enough to live there permanently. So the next time you spread something on your toast without even thinking about it, without weighing options, without making a decision at all, you're not just eating breakfast. You're standing inside someone else's very old, very deliberate answer to a question most companies never even think to ask. Not, how do I make my product taste better, but, how do I make my product part of a day that already exists? And somewhere in Piedmont, decades ago, a wartime shortage of cocoa quietly became one of the most repeated purchases on the planet.